Welcome everyone who is here with us live, as well as those who are listening in to this session after the recording is provided. We welcome you to our session focused on gender equality and gender protections and the IRMA standards. Our session will be starting very soon, and if we're ready, I will go ahead and provide a brief overview of our agenda today. Let's get started. So on the next slide, we'll briefly provide some house rules for our discussion today. We are so excited to hear from all of you on this call, to hear from those of you who want to give us your input on this chapter and on any aspect of the IRMA standard for responsible mining and mineral processing. We'll overview ways to contribute, provide more information about the broader revision process and timeline, overview the chapter on gender and propose changes, and engage in a Q&A and live chat session. I'll turn over now to my colleague Pierre to further introduce our team and give an overview of the IRMA standard for responsible mining.
Yeah, thank you, Christy, and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure for us to host you today. So this event is a series of live consultation events, and they are hosted by IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. Today we're hosting you together with my colleague, so Christy Disney-Bruckner, our Law and Policy Director, who you just heard. We also have Beth Jean Evans from the team and Alan Septoff. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available on the IRMA website. I'm sharing just a few reminders and house rules with you today. Participants may not post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content. So we remind you to not post or send any, link to hateful, degrading, criminal, sensitive content, imagery, or advocate intolerance or hate against other people. Participants may not post or send or link to any spam content or any activity that would, try to drive attention to unrelated services or initiatives. And why am I saying this? We can go to the next slide. It's because you may have noticed that there are different options for you to contribute. This event represents one of the many opportunities that IRMA is organizing for everybody around the world, all stakeholders, to contribute to the IRMA standard revision process, which is why we're here today. We'll say a bit more later on. That includes a dedicated online platform for comments that you can find online, www.responsibemining.net/commons2. Before today's session, we're offering you two ways to contribute to this revision process. First, you can use the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. You can use this function to submit any comment, suggestion, feedback, question, concern, recommendation to IRMA on the chapter that we are talking about today, but also in general. And I'm very much aware that some of you may have already read the draft chapter and they have comments, suggestions they want to share with us. Please, you can start to do this right off now. For others who are maybe less familiar with the draft content that we're going to present today, it's absolutely fine. And again, you have all opportunities throughout the event to submit your comment or suggestion. And one thing that is important with the Q&A function, and that's part of our policy and best practice in capturing and gathering comments and feedback, you can take the anonymous option when submitting content to IRMA. Next slide, please, Alan, which is not the case with the chat function. We have also enabled the chat here in Zoom, so feel free to use it to share similar content, but knowing that you'll be sharing it with the whole audience. And again, we invite you to, start doing this whenever you want as we go through the presentation. But note that the chat cannot be used in an anonymous way, unlike the Q&A function. Next slide, please. Yes, and that's a reminder that, as I've said, this is part of the revision process. And so all the content that you will share with us today will be saved, will be considered by IRMA as part of the standard revision process, as with any other communication channel that you may use. Next slide, please. Right, so about the IRMA revision process itself, just to give you a little bit more background and information, we're doing this comprehensive revision of the IRMA standard for responsible mining, which is really the foundational report and resource and standard of IRMA. And we're doing it for multiple reasons. First, we want to ensure that the system and the standard remains accountable to all our sectors and remains aligned with our mission and vision. So as IRMA evolves and as our sectors and stakeholder groups evolve, we want to make sure that we continuously align and respond to that. Then in practical terms, the kind of changes and revision that we can do are multiple again. One is to remain up to date, so make sure that the requirements we have for entities reflect the latest understanding in the space of responsible mineral value chain and responsible mining. We are also using this opportunity to add clarity throughout the standard to make it clearer, more accessible, more meaningful for all stakeholders, including for auditors, to make the standard more auditable. We're also using this moment to add consistency to better align the structure and flow of the chapters and the principle where they're similar. And we're really doing this from the perspective of grounding in or embedding good and sound management systems, practice, and models throughout the standard. And I'll say a bit more about that later. And then it's also a wonderful opportunity for us to fill any gaps that would be in the current version of the standard, the 2018, for two reasons: whether there would have been issues where IRMA was not looking into enough details, but also in some scenarios where IRMA, over the course of 5 years now, may have fallen a little bit behind and gaps have emerged. And then if we go on the next slide, there's also a very important driver and reason for us to do this revision and think about it in a very comprehensive way. Is an evolution of the IRMA standard to address all key phases of the mineral supply chain. So the IRMA standard, the version 1 that many of you are aware of and probably familiar with, the standard for responsible mining, only applies and covers mineral extraction, so the mining activities per se. But in 2021, IRMA published 2 drafts proposing standard to also cover exploration and development, so the early stage and phases before commissioning and starting operating a mine, and also a draft standard for responsible mineral processing, so next steps along the value chain when the processing of the mineral takes place. And we're proposing here to integrate, to unify them into one single standard. So this is the draft standard for responsible mining and mineral processing that we have released last month. Next slide, please. So this new draft that I just mentioned, what is it and what's in there? That's also important for everybody to know and be reminded. This is not a final IRMA board approved standard. It's really an invitation for comments from all stakeholders around the world on the content, not just the requirements, but also the rationale, the approach to best practice, and we're providing the context for the proposed changes and questions. So the board, IRMA board, equally governed, has approved the rationale and the fact that we're sharing this with the world, but it's still very much work in progress, and we will take into account all the comments and feedback that we receive. We've included in this draft a number of notes and background information at the beginning of each chapter, where we summarize the changes that we propose, why, and we indicate also where there are brand new indicators or requirements, and then where have slightly or more moderately revised existing requirements. And we have also laid out a number of key consultation questions that have been raised during the revision, this sort of first draft revision process. And we're asking specific feedback and input to help IRMA resolve them. And then if you're more comfortable with an Excel version of this draft, it's also available on our website. And I want to also re-emphasize, and I didn't say that yesterday in the first chapter we covered, this whole draft is also available in Spanish. You can find it on our website if it's easier for you and more appropriate. Next slide, please. A few words to say how this draft was built. We really learned from the initial IRMA audits. So the first standard for responsible mining that was published in 2018 has been now put in practice. You may know that IRMA has published 4 public audit reports already, and we have about 10 or 12 that are also in the process of being finalizing, and that will be very soon published and available on our website. So IRMA is really scaling up in terms of adoption, and we've learned a lot from this on-the-ground implementation. So we've used that learning and experience in particular to add clarity, make sure the requirements are more easier to audit, more consistent. We've also reviewed, evolution around standards, norms, society's expectations, best practice, emerging issues. We've taken into account the comments that we received on these 2 drafts that I mentioned before for exploration and development and mineral processing. And we've also taken the advantage of the ongoing stakeholder engagement activities and work that IRMA has been doing over the last 5 years, including a number of expert working groups that were set up to address a number of issues, including one on gender, the chapter that we're presenting today. And if we go to the next slide, I'll share a few reminding elements around the consultation period. So we've published the draft last month, and it's now open for a public comment period for 3 months. And like I said, there are many ways to participate. Today's event and the series of live consultations that we're organizing are one of the multiple ways, and comments will be considered all equally and objectively. And all the content that we receive as part of our IRMA leading the transparency by example, and also to abide by best practice for standard and standard revision, we will publish a public summary of all the comments that we've received and how we've taken them into account. Next slide. To go through these different channels, so as I said, we have an online dedicated platform where you can comment on every chapter individually, every requirement. You can also share some more general comments. There's a section dedicated for that if you want to share your comments, and that's really our preferred way of receiving these comments. But on the next slide, you'll see that we also have perhaps more traditional ways to receive your comments. So you can send them via email to the comments@responsiblemining.net email address. You can use our WhatsApp line and also our physical address. You can find all of this on our website. Now, this is where we get to the core and the reason for today's live consultation is to really go through the proposed changes, actually the proposed additions to the IRMA standard. And I'll turn to my colleague, Christy, to introduce that.
Thank you, Pierre. Well, I see a lot of people on this call who have already provided expertise to inform this chapter. So I thank you for your input and contributions, and all who will have contributions to come. So the IRMA standard for responsible mining chapter on gender aims to achieve and maintain gender equality, gender mainstreaming, and gender protections in the workplace and communities where mining and mineral processing takes place. And the scope of application is for exploration, mining, and mineral processing projects and operators. And as we move on to the next slide, we want to remind everyone that although we're proposing addition of this standalone chapter on gender, gender continues to be a thread throughout the IRMA standard. So there's some examples of the many places that this topic appears across themes and topic areas in the IRMA standard. For example, in community and stakeholder engagement, in complaints and grievance mechanisms and access to remedy, and on assessment of gender-specific impacts across a range of topics. For example, looking at how benefits are delivered, environmental and social impact assessments, issues around land, displacement, and resettlement. This also comes up, for example, under human rights due diligence, fair labor in terms of work, including equal pay for equal work, parental leave, issues around PPE under occupational health and safety, and gender appropriate facilities comes up under that chapter as well. Community health and safety, security arrangements. These are just some examples. And we're so pleased to have our colleague Beth Jean Evans on the call today, who can help respond to questions across all of these themes as well. So we'll give in the next few slides, a bit of a deeper dive into the gender chapter. But if you have questions or comments, recommendations about any aspect of how we're addressing gender or how we should be addressing it in the IRMA standard, we welcome those both on this live consultation and in any of the many ways that you would like to provide comments to us. And moving on to the next slide, I'll turn back to Pierre.
Thank you, Christy. And yes, so you're really inviting everyone today to use either the Q&A function or the chat if you want to start sharing with us. And so the proposed changes and the reason, for creating this brand new chapter as compared with the 2018 standard that is currently in force. It's really, if you look at some of these icons that I showed earlier about the drivers for the revision, we really thought the need to fill some gaps here. So we wanted to propose a chapter that complements what Christy described, how gender has been integrated as a transversal issue and cross-cutting all the principles of the IRMA standard to offer additional and complementary requirements that aim to advance gender equality and gender protections. Next slide, please. And then in terms of how we've done this proposition, this new draft chapter, we also looked at this consistency lens that I mentioned before, and we really wanted to organize this chapter around the same flow as other social and environmental responsibility chapters that have a similar pattern. So here we've elaborated on the need to have a policy, then the need and the requirement for entities, whether mine sites or mineral processors, to do an assessment of gender-related risks and opportunities, that then inform the development of a management plan to address these issues and maximize these opportunities, which need to be combined with progress monitoring, effectiveness tracking that can subsequently help update and continuously improve the management plans and those risk assessment or opportunity assessment. And then there's always this very strong requirement and dimension in the IRMA standard around transparency and meaningful reporting. Next slide, please. And here I'm showing this very, common, I think, universal chart around how does one operationalize continuous improvement. And one way to summarize it is with this wheel to plan, do, check, act to operationalize continuous improvement. And that's a chart that I've been showing and I will be showing, I think, with pretty much all chapters in the IRMA standard, because that's really a core element to, promote and foster continuous improvement. So here we see that the, policy risk assessment really maps out to the plan element. Then when it comes to doing, it's really much aligned with this management plan that needs to be developed and put in place. The checking element is where the monitoring of progress and effectiveness tracking needs to happen. And then the act, where you can, close the loop and start retro feeding into, the other steps, is where the management plans and risk assessment needs to be updated and informed by the progress monitoring. And then if you click, Alan, we'll see again here this sort of element at the heart of it around open data and reporting. We've also added clarity, and we have done our best to remain up to date and align with a number of definitions and guidance that have been proposed by multilateral institutions around gender diversity, gender equality, gender mainstreaming, gender protections, intersectional vulnerable groups. And all these new definitions are also open for comments and contributions. And as we move now to, I think, the specific requirements one by one, to give you more details on the structure, I'll ask Christy to get us started, please.
Thank you, Pierre. As Pierre has demonstrated for us, we really start with the basics in this chapter of a policy commitment that includes acknowledgement of the entity. This might be the mining company, the mineral processing company, to advance gender equality and gender mainstreaming, and to ensure that gender protections respect all internationally recognized human rights. And you can see there the list of what the policy is required to have. But this is a very first step. And we'll move on to the next slide. The next topic that comes up is the gender impact and opportunities assessment. It was important to our expert working group on gender to not only look at impacts and risks related to gender, but to also look for opportunities. We recognize that the mining sector is a sector where women are working and finding opportunity, where there can be benefits as well as negative impacts. And that includes for workers at the site as well as for individuals in the community. So we're looking at ways to identify and assess these topics and follow a credible methodology, make sure that these assessments are carried out by competent professionals, drawing on external gender expertise, and that they're informed by consultations with potentially affected rights holders, including different genders, ages, ethnicities, we really want to take an intersectional approach to how we're looking at this topic. On to the next slide. I'll turn back over to Pierre.
Thank you, Christy. Yes, and so this is where, following these first building blocks and key requirements, we are adding here more details on what the impact assessment should include. So as part of the assessment, to fully meet this requirement, there's a need for an explanation of the methodology that is used, an analysis of the gender norms, gender equality, gender protection context that is applicable to the country and the area of operation or area of where the project is being developed, including norms and contexts that may have negative adverse impacts and the drivers for those impacts, but also that can create opportunities. There's a need to integrate an overview of the laws that are applicable, including customary or traditional laws. And then we are specifying here a number of minimum factors, gender-related factors that need to be taken into account. And we'll come back to it later because it's part of one of the consultation questions that we've put in the draft for all of you to reflect and contribute. But we've put here a number of very practical, tangible elements that need to be taken into account when it comes to gender inequalities within the workplace, gender-specific risks in the workplace, including violence, sexual harassment, intimidation, health and safety issues, gender-specific barriers to employment, including, again, I think very much from this intersectional approach that Christy mentioned. It's not just about the sex that you were given at birth, but including education level, training opportunities, family roles, cultural norms, legal statutes, health and safety again. Gender-specific barriers to engagement when it comes to consultations, training, capacity building, gender-specific differences in equitable community development, benefit sharing opportunities, restoration of livelihoods, and also benefiting in a fair way in the outcomes of resettlement action plans, for example, again, when relevant. Also gender-specific risks in the community, so mirroring some of the risks that can be found in the workplace around violence, harassment, sexual harassment, intimidation, and also opportunities to collaborate with stakeholders to promote gender equity and gender empowerment in the community and within the workplace. And also the assessment, we require entities to make sure they include identification of rights holders and the recommended actions or measures that could be taken by the entity to prevent, mitigate, remediate those risks and impacts, and maximizing the opportunities. And that will then inform, I think if we go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, still one more slide on the, yeah, no, we can move to the next slide, Alan. But still around the assessment of impact and opportunities, we are also requiring, and auditors will go and verify and audit that stakeholders and rights holders who participated in the assessment process are not just consulted, but they also have the opportunity to review the key issues, the findings, and then they can provide feedback on the assessment findings and the proposed strategies to prevent. So really trying to have this constructive dialogue and stakeholder engagement around not only the risk identification, but also the actions that are going to be taken. And a requirement around, regular updates of the assessment, especially when there are proposed changes to activities or in the business model or business relationships that may create new risks or change. So this is really much not a, just a one-off exercise, as with any other social environmental risk assessment and the way it's been reflected across the IRMA standard. I think,
Thank
Christy,
you, Pierre.
you can take it from there. Thank you.
So the next piece of this framework is the management plan. Creation of a gender management plan that must be developed and implemented to prevent, mitigate, and remediate the most salient gender-related risk and impacts, and promote gender equity and empowerment in the project or operation and in affected communities. So again, we're looking not only at the work sites, but also to affected communities. And you can see what must be included in the plan. That again, it's developed by competent professionals, outlining specific actions, looking at identifying key indicators, looking for implementation, and really looking at what is the implementation schedule, human resources, budget that are needed, and making sure that stakeholders have access to and are informed about a rights compatible grievance mechanism. We have an entire chapter that looks at the grievance mechanism and access to remedy, but mention that again here in the context of this chapter and this process, making sure that concerns can be raised and that recourse can be sought for any grievances related to gender impacts. Moving on to the next slide, we look at monitoring and evaluation, and I will just briefly cover this and hope that we circle back to this about what you would like to see for monitoring and evaluation. The entity is required to monitor prevention, mitigation, remediation strategies related to salient gender risk and impacts, and efforts to promote gender equity and empowerment, and making sure that the management plan is being effectively implemented. Monitoring includes these two factors at a minimum: documentation of actual performance, and including feedback from internal and external sources, including affected rights holders. And we have proposed that at least annually or more frequently that the entity reviews monitoring results, grievances, and evaluates the effectiveness of the strategies. And based on that review, the management plan will be updated if necessary to improve effectiveness. Moving on to the next slide, I'll turn back to Pierre to cover reporting.
Thanks, Christian. And I think now we've closed this plan, do, check, act model, sort of virtuous model for continuous improvement. And this is where here we have put together this sort of transparency dimension with a requirement for the entity to annually report in a public manner on whether these, its gender equality and gender protection activities are, being effective. So the reporting must include the methods that are used to determine the issues, the risks and impacts that were identified, and the actions taken at site level to, prevent, and then if not possible to prevent, mitigate, and or remedy the gender risk and impact, and also to promote gender equity and empowerment. So in addition to the ongoing stakeholder engagement with locally affected stakeholders, communities, workers, there's also a requirement here to have some public reporting. And I think this really aligns. I mean, we'll talk about it, but I'm very excited about this chapter, and we'll see, what the feedback are. But we've heard so many times that it's one of the blind spot, and there's been so much guidance and elements around, how mining companies and companies in the mineral value chain could conduct gender-specific impact assessment, opportunity assessment. and we haven't seen a lot. So hoping that, you know, the IRMA system will also help frame this in a very practical and meaningful way. And we can go to the next slide. We have just a few more slides that we want to share with you today before we, you know, take on some of the questions, comments that are already coming in. And again, inviting you again and reminding you that you can use either the chat or the Q&A function today to share content with us. We said, and Christy said earlier, that, you know, this chapter is applicable to all the phases, so from exploration to mining to mineral processing. And some chapters in the proposed draft standard may only be applicable to, for example, mineral processing. Some requirements are only applicable to exploration. But here it really applies to all phases with some differentiation between, and here we see at the very initial stage 1 exploration, which is really a desk-based process, and sort of setting up the first element for the mining exploration. There's still, you know, a policy that is required and doing some initial scoping around impacts and opportunities. And you can find the full applicability document where you can see for every single requirement how they apply or not to the different phases of the mineral value chains. You can find that on our website. Next slide, please. Right, so here, and I said that when introducing the structure of the draft and what's in the draft standard, I said that we've in particular highlighted key consultation questions. In all chapters, there are also some consultation questions around the sort of general and overarching mechanics of the draft, but you'll find them under every chapter. And we've pulled out here a number of key ones where we think it'd be extremely valuable to hear comments and inputs from all stakeholders, really. So the first one that we've reproduced here on this presentation is around the reporting frequency. So I just said before that we're proposing a requirement for entities. So when we say entities, either a mine site or a mineral processing entity, to report publicly on an annual basis with regard to the effectiveness of its gender equality and gender protection activities. We're wondering and would like to have you know, more opinions on whether this is appropriate. Should there be a different time frame? Is it too often? Is it not enough? In any circumstances that should prompt, you know, a public report beyond this sort of set time frequency. So that's one thing. If we go to the next slide, we have, I think, two more. And that one is actually related to what I described also under the key gender-related factors that we've listed as minimum requirements for what needs to be included in a gender impact assessment and gender opportunity assessment. So here, you know, I've not put all the details again, but we mentioned, you know, inequalities and risks and barriers within the workplace, within communities, when it comes to employment, engagement, benefiting from community development, benefit sharing, resettlement, etc. And we're also wondering here and really hoping to receive comments and feedback on any other factors that may be needed, or if some of them are not appropriate or shouldn't be listed as minimum factors. And finally, one more key consultation question before we go to the, I think, the more conversational mode today. I think we have two more. And this is where it comes to, you know, situations where, and we're very much aware of this, I think it's been discussed also among our working group, that people may prefer to not disclose and share information about their gender whenever it comes to, you know, initial mapping and scoping, but also with the grievance mechanism, the gender-specific grievance mechanism. And that would then make it more challenging, potentially, for the entity to understand, assess, address the gender-related dimensions linked to that potential impacts or grievance or complaints. And again, this is not necessarily addressed in a very detailed way in the draft currently. So we're also wondering if we should include a requirement that specifically allows for a preference to not disclose, and the reasons for that. Any solution in a practical example or context that you would like to share with us. And the same with other, intersectional factors that are not just necessarily, for example, saying I'm a man, I'm a woman, non-binary of a gender, but all the other factors that we've listed earlier. And finally, and I think this is a good segue, and maybe Christy, you wanna take it on this last consultation question if we go to the next slide, exactly about this intersectional approach. I know it's one of the questions that has also been coming in. So over to you.
Yeah, so just reiterating again that we really see how assessing impact really requires looking across a range of factors that may include, gender, whether someone is indigenous or whether someone is of a certain ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, disability, geographic location, sexual orientation, religion, marital status, a range. These are just some examples that we are looking at how to take this into consideration in impact assessment and how we define various terms in the IRMA standard. So you'll see definitions specifically shared in this chapter, and we seek your input on those as well. And we'll move on to the next slide to remind you again about the ways to provide comments.
Thank you very much, Christy. And so here, again, thanks for your attention, and we hope that going through this overview was helpful. I know some of you had already looked at the draft, and we've started receiving comments and questions through these different channels. But again, inviting you to contribute. Today I can see that we have a question which is maybe more technical about the gender assessment requirement, where we require a company or an entity to do, I think, a very comprehensive and thorough mapping of the different laws and contexts. And so the question is, will this be then available on a platform so that others can have access to the mapping, such as local or even state legislation, to not reproduce the work that others are doing? I think that's super interesting. I don't think we have a technical requirement that specifically says it has to be shared, but if you want to add anything here, it could definitely be highlighted as best practice.
Yeah, I would like to ask Beth to respond to that question, and we can add some comments to that. But Beth, do you want to take that one?
I actually saw that Alan had volunteered to answer it live, so I'll hand it back over to him.
Great.
I think it's doing that so that they become visible to everyone, Beth. So it's really, if you want to reflect back, you can.
Yeah, I don't have much to to add beyond that. That might be an option once that mapping has been done. But yeah, I don't really have much to add to that, to be honest.
Okay, great.
I'll just have a couple of thoughts. One is, when the updated standard is final, it will be an opportunity to use the international standard in all aspects to serve as a benchmark for assessing and improving rule of law. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here to look for more opportunities to do these types of to set policy, to promote assessment of these factors, both risks and opportunities, to provide management plans, reporting that is transparently available. So there are other requirements in the IRMA standard that relate to information and how information is shared with stakeholders and rights holders. And of course, when an IRMA audit is conducted, the audit report resulting, that report is made available on the IRMA website. So there's a range of ways in which this information can be made available through the range of different requirements around engaging and making sure that information is made available. But we also welcome your input on what you think should be required. If there are some additional points that you would recommend for us, we welcome you to chime in on those.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. I think that, added some very good content and clarification. One question, and I think even, as I've joined IRMA very recently and having, kept an eye on IRMA and having been, reading it and using it for quite some time, I had always been wondering why there wasn't a gender-specific chapter. And I think there's always this tension between sort of the full integration mode, because yes, of course, gender inequality and gender issues are transversal and ought to be integrated throughout, responsible mining standards. But there's also, on the other hand, the need for, increasing visibility and assessing or addressing a number of very specific gaps. So I'm wondering if you, Christy and Beth, want, to say more about the sort of journey and maybe some of the recent work that the working group did. And then while you're thinking about it, I see that there's another comment in the chat right now, echoing this comment on the need to, share the mapping work and the work that has been done, realizing that sometimes information may be public, but it's hard to know where to find things. So it might also be a more an issue of centralization and sharing information.
Thanks, Pierre. There's so much we could say about all the discussions that have been formed in this draft. But one is that because there are so many points across the IRMA standard for responsible mining where gender-related topics arise, we didn't want this to be an either-or proposition. If we had this chapter that was requiring a gender equality and gender protections and gender opportunities assessments, we wanted to also maintain a thread throughout the other chapters. And we're also thinking, as we develop standards for IRMA, what are requirements that can be audited? So when we are setting a standard, the audits are conducted by an independent third party under IRMA, and we want to make sure that audit requirements are applicable across a wide range of jurisdictions, across a wide range of materials, and also that we reduce duplication where possible, where topics may come up more than once in the standard, that we don't have topics audited more than once. So we wanted to also be efficient. So there's that balance between trying to be very streamlined, but also trying to reduce any redundancy across the IRMA standard. And Beth, you're an expert on auditing as well. I wonder if you would like to make any other comments around balancing that.
No, I think that's it. And I think that we've made great, strides in this version of the standard in terms of streamlining those things to make sure that they are touched on in each individual chapter. So for example, you can't get an excellent rating on grievances for gender in the gender chapter, but then the actual grievance chapter itself is a terribly low rating. So we're very conscientious of those things. And I think we've done a lot of work in this chapter to effectively link those. There's actually was another question from in the Q&A, and if we're okay, I can answer the second half of that at least.
Yes, please, for sure, Beth, if you can read it out for us, and absolutely.
Definitely. So the question was, in terms of gender assessment and planning, any recommendations from IRMA to hire local women as much as possible, whether for mobilization, facilitation, or other necessary activities? And a second question from the same individual, any complaints mechanism or open channel specifically for women with female listening? So I'll start with the second part of that. There are references in an overall comment. First of all, I do want to emphasize the importance of guidance notes, which obviously are not included in the requirements themselves, but they're going to be accompanying text for auditors that are going to elaborate on a lot of these points. And the idea there is obviously not every single word, every single permutation, every single, example could be included in the requirement. So the guidance notes that are on development are going to have an important role in specifying such things. So for example, in the grievance mechanism chapter, we do ask that there's an assessment of barriers for equitably putting forth grievances to a variety of potentially vulnerable groups. And as one potentially vulnerable group, not necessarily vulnerable, but potentially vulnerable, obviously women, youth, Indigenous persons, minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that requirement that it assesses, in X cultural context, what could be some barriers for women putting forth grievances. And this is in addition to obvious things like the ability to put forward anonymous grievances, et cetera. And so in that grievance mechanism guidance notes, we would specify that, in instances where women are not comfortable putting forward grievances through, for example, a committee that may or may not be constituted fully of men, that there'd be other options. Or, for example, the guidance notes would state that if it's a gender-based violence grievance, that would be dealt with by a woman or by somebody who's an expert in such issues, in gender-based issues. So there are both in the requirements themselves, but also in the guidance notes that are going to come accompanying those requirements. There are provisions in there to make sure that the grievance mechanism is equitable to gender. The other half of the question related to more the labor chapter. I don't know if somebody else wants to hop in, or I can take a shot at that one as well.
Yeah, I think, my understanding is that, it relates both to the health and safety chapter, but it's also about, hiring local women for the gender assessment and gender, management planning activities. So mobilizing, facilitating other activities. So I guess it can touch on two. And if you want to elaborate on that, absolutely.
Sure. Please go ahead, and I'll jump in as well.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead, Beth, please. You wanted to share, so do it.
So I do think there's a number of ways, a number of chapters in which is actually relevant. It can be labor hiring practices. It can also be community development programs that emphasize women. Even in the resettlement chapter, I think there's also components of livelihood restoration programs, and links to markets or whatever that looks like in a particular context, and the extent to which that can also emphasize or promote the involvement of women. So we do touch on these in several chapters, and the labor chapter in particular talks about obviously non-discrimination. There is deference to existing hiring quotas that might be promoted locally, or priorities that the company has. I do not believe we specifically mandate that there should be a preference for women. It's more from an equality perspective of non-discrimination and making sure that women aren't discriminated against because of their gender. Christy mentioned before gender appropriate PPE. And there's also, we've added something new about equal pay for equal work. And that's, we're expanding that concept a little bit beyond the way it's traditionally conceived, which is that women and men doing equal work receive equal pay. And we're actually, the idea is there to apply it to not just men and women, but to any group that may be receiving less pay for equal work as a result of some sort of characteristic. So yeah, I do think we do touch on those issues in a couple chapters, but again, we are, be open to hearing any suggestions if we need to be more specific, if we need to be more prescriptive across any of these chapters. And again, there's going to be sessions touching more specifically on labor, on community benefits, on resettlement in the coming weeks. So happy to receive comments either here or through those chapters as well.
And thank you, Beth and Christy. Before I let you, add anything you want to add in here, I'm just going to read out two more questions that we've received now. One about contractors and suppliers of mining companies. So do the gender requirements apply to them? And if so, how IRMA suggests mining companies can track this also among their suppliers and contractors? And then another question, maybe more for you, Beth, about auditors. Like, are auditors trained in gender risk, gender mainstreaming, etc., understanding all the nuances to be able to perform the audit and the verification in a meaningful and appropriate manner? So maybe first to you, Christy, if you want to add anything to what Beth said or take any of these questions, and then I'll go back to you, Beth, before we close at the top of the hour.
Great. I will just say yes to both of those questions. That again, you'll just see as a theme throughout our standard and system, that this is a topic that is very close to the heart of IRMA and extends even to the governance of IRMA as a system and seeking gender balance. But certainly there are many aspects of making sure that this intersectional approach and inclusiveness, sensitivity to local cultures, a wide range of issues, and expertise must be demonstrated by third-party auditors before they are approved to take on an independent third-party IRMA audit. We have a whole another set of requirements around that topic, and we will be reviewing those in the coming year, but right now we're focused on the standard. But we're always open to your input around any aspect of the IRMA standard and system, and I'll turn to you, Beth, for any additions to that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's high level requirements for all auditors, but I do also want to add that with the new standard comes a new auditor training for that standard. So this is obviously a new chapter, which gives us an opportunity to equally update the training, and it's a fairly extensive training that all IRMA auditors have to go through before they become certified to audit the IRMA standard. So I've been working on that training personally, and we were going to definitely be touching on gender's always been, a component, but with this new chapter and with some modifications and some stronger language in some of the chapters, we're definitely be reflecting that in the training and also in the requirements for certification bodies and making sure that the social auditors and the audit team in general is well versed in gender issues so that they can effectively address those requirements.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. And to re-emphasize what Beth and Christy have said about the standard being one element in a suite or corpus of other working documents, and we really want to wait and hear from all stakeholders on the proposed changes, and then we will absolutely update all the accompanying guidance material, the training modules, the auditor manual, the kind of template and files they use to do the auditing. So all of this will be brought up to date with the new standard once it's finalized, and all this was will obviously be made publicly available. I see that we're reaching the time now, so I will just like to thank everyone again for contributing, participating, attending today. Remind you that the public comment period is open until the end of January, and we would very much love to receive your additional input, comments. Everything that was shared today will be, carefully recorded and taken into account, and we remain here as a resource if you want to reach out to IRMA. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.